Hi, I'm Danielle, and I'm one of the leaders of Substance Moms. And for those of you who may not know me, my husband Johnny and I have lived in the Twin Cities for 10 years and been a part of Substance for 6. We have 3 daughters. They are 6, 4, and then my baby just turned 2, which is just crazy. You also might recognize me from the Substance Moms blog, as I regularly write over there. So, in light of this crazy year, this morning I would like to talk about how we all experience life stress and hardship in life, but how I don't believe that has to take us into crisis mode. So I was sitting with my mentor recently, and we were talking about a few times lately where my life had descended into crisis mode. Now, crisis mode for me often looks like burnout, fatigue, reaching the end of my ability to cope, a decline in my mental health. Maybe for you it looks like getting stuck in isolation or self-medication. But whatever the case may be, I think we've all been in crisis mode before in the past. So within the past few years, I've descended at least a little bit into crisis mode at least 3 times. I had a rough postpartum period after one of my children. We had a difficult medical diagnosis for another one of my children. And then even the process of deciding what kindergarten to send my child to sometimes felt like this prolonged, overwhelming crisis. So back to this conversation with my mentor. So we were discussing how poorly I react to criticism in times of crisis, right? Anyone else there? But after a while, she looked at me and she said, "Danielle, why are these things throwing you into crisis mode in the first place?" And there's a question. I guess I'd always just assumed that difficult times, hardships, stress comes, and you just live in crisis mode for a while, right? So this idea that I didn't have to allow difficult times to throw me into crisis mode was pretty revolutionary. John 16:33 says, "In this world you will have trouble." So I used to just expect that when trouble came, you go to crisis mode. However, I don't believe that God teaches that crisis mode has to be a given. The second half of John 16:33 alludes to that. "But take heart, I have overcome the world." I believe that we can prevent hardship from taking us into crisis mode by doing 3 things. Number 1, walking out God's priorities for our life, and continuing to invest in the big things and letting the smaller things go, and then trusting God for the outcome at all times. So there's an interesting passage in Luke 8 that I believe illustrates this really well. At the beginning of Luke 8, Jesus is surrounded by the crowds. There are people pressing in from all directions. He's giving parables, he's talking, the sower, the seed, those are all in the beginning of Luke 8. In fact, there's so many people around that when his mother and brothers come and try to reach him, they can't even get near to him. So there's this big party going on, and when Jesus is done sharing and talking, he knows that he needs rest. So he takes his disciples, they leave the party, they get into a boat to go to the other side of the lake. Knowing that he needs rest, Jesus falls asleep. Over and over again, we see Jesus walking out just the best priorities. Maybe he's about to go into a time of hardship, so he starts by going up to the mountain to meet with his Father face to face first. He rests when he needs rest. When Jesus gets on the boat, he falls asleep. A windstorm came down on the lake, and verse 23 said, "And the boat was filling with water, and they were in danger. So the disciples went and woke him up, saying, 'Master, Master, we are perishing.' Jesus awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased. And he said to the disciples, 'Where is your faith?'" So in contrast to Jesus' excellent priorities, we often see the disciples making different choices. Now, I'm sure at this point they are socially and emotionally exhausted as well. And if there are any introverts among them, like even more so, right? But instead of falling asleep on the boat, they stay awake. They are anxiously watching the water. When the storm comes, you can see the result of their 2 different ways of living. Jesus fell asleep, knowing that he needed rest and trusting God for the outcome of his life. The disciples stayed awake, believing that their lives and safety were in their own hands, and they ended up going to Jesus and waking him up when the storm came, having descended into crisis mode. "Master, Master, we are perishing." Now that sounds like crisis mode to me. So I'd like you to think for a moment about a time when you were in crisis mode. For me, having a newborn is probably the closest that I've come to living for an extended period of time in crisis mode. I have 3 girls, and the first time around, newborn life took me by surprise. You just don't know what to expect, right? I had some postpartum complications. I was on some medications. I was sick and sleep deprived for months. I struggled with my mental and emotional health. And honestly, the process of moving into motherhood just felt like I lost a big part of who I was, some identity crisis. So I descended into into crisis mode for a few months there. When my second daughter came 2 years later, she was 5 days old, and we got that call from the doctor that just no one wants to get. Some of her newborn screenings had come back, and she had tested positive for an inborn genetic condition. So we descended into crisis mode again. She had weekly labs I had to take her to the hospital for. I was on the phone with specialty medical companies, formula companies, pharmaceutical companies, my insurance company to pay for it all, right? I know them by name, you guys. It's crazy. Anyone with a kid with some of these diagnoses will definitely know where I'm at here. So again, our family descended into crisis mode for a while. During that time, I got into some bad habits. I stopped eating as healthily as I should. I stopped reading my Bible as regularly as I used to. I wasn't prioritizing time with Johnny and other life-giving relationships, so I started feeling disconnected. Times of stress and crisis are not the time to figure out and decide what's important to you. And if you're trying to make those decisions in the middle of crisis, just like me, you're probably going to make some really bad decisions about how to spend your time. Which is why I believe that it's important to figure out your priorities before you descend into hardships. Just like you hear at Substance all the time, that you find and invest in relationships in your community before you need your community. I think the same is true of figuring out what your priorities are. So after I'd had my second daughter, it took months to climb out of crisis mode and get things back on track again. And I totally changed things up. I started eating better, I started exercising, I prioritized daily time with God, I went to therapy, I started going to bed earlier and getting sleep. Our bodies, souls, and spirit, I believe, can only handle so much neglect and abuse before they start protesting. And for me, that looked like burnout, fatigue, and overwhelm. It was crisis mode. So during that time, I felt very convicted to ask God how He would align my priorities, and then to do everything in my power to walk those out on a daily basis. So I began writing out in list format, top to bottom, what my priorities actually were. Around that time, I was reading in my devotional written by Nikki Gumbel, who's the pioneer and director of Alpha, and he had this self-sort activity that he encouraged people to do. So we're going to do it this morning. So there are 5 different huge life priorities. If you get the big ones in line, sometimes the smaller ones will fall into place a little bit easier. So we're going to sort out these 5 huge priorities. The priorities are kids, ministry, job, spouse, and God. I'll say those again in a minute, but I'd like you to write them into 2 lists, top to bottom. The first list, I'd like you to write out what you believe that you are living right now in your life. In the second list, I'd like you to write out top to bottom how you believe God would have you live your life, or how you believe the Bible encourages us as Christians, if you're a follower of Christ, to have those priorities. So you can pause the video, I'll say them again: job, kids, ministry, spouse, and God. And then you can come back once you have your 2 lists. All right, welcome back. So according to Nikki Gumbel, the correct biblical order for those 5 priorities is God first, and then spouse, then kids. A lot of people that I've talked to want to put those on the same level, like family is number 2. But there's actually a lot of biblical references and scriptures that talk about how spouse and then kids is the proper order, biblically speaking. And then next, job, and then finally ministry. And a lot of people might want to put ministry like above job or even higher, but Nikki Gumbel says that your job is where you go for 20, 40, 60 hours a day. If you work, I currently don't, I stay at home. But if you work, you should be walking out your job as your primary ministry. Through all of those hours that you spend at work, you should be loving on your coworkers, acting in an ethical and moral way, and shining the light of Christ at your job as your primary ministry. And then, of course, ministry it doesn't come last on our priority list. It's just one of the top 5. It's a very important thing that we do spend a lot of time, energy, and effort on, and that's important. So obviously my list has more than just these 5 items. My list is actually 30 to 40 items long. So when I wrote mine out, I really teased out some of these priorities. So for example, instead of just writing kids in the number 3 spot, I actually teased it out to driving my children to their activities, throwing big birthday parties for my kids. So both of those 2 things are a little bit lower on my priority list than things like praying for my kids, memorizing scripture with my kids, intentionally disciplining them well, or getting to know my kids' friends. So writing out these nuanced priorities, top to bottom, has really helped me to visualize when I am sacrificing something important for something trivial, and then to correct that in my life. And I'm going to tell you, establishing priorities is a process. It takes time. For about a year after my second was born, I fought God on the most basic of priorities. So Proverbs 3:6 says, "In everything you do, put God first, and he will direct you and crown your efforts with success." And literally for like a year, guys, I wanted to put keep my kids alive as priority number 1. Like I wrote it on my list, keep my kids alive, God. And every time I did that, I felt God asking me to trust him with my kids, and that if I put him first in my life, that he would take care of them. Now, is God asking me to spend a 2-hour quiet time with him while I let my kids wander off a cliff? No, he's not. So over and over again, I've asked God the question, God, what does it look like in this life stage for me to put you first in my life? And I'm going to say that again. God, what does it look like in this life stage for me to put you first in my life? And this is a question that I think we all need to ask God throughout our changing life stages, because it will look different. And not just for this priority, but for all of them. I think we need to bring our priorities to God and ask him what it looks like for us to walk out those priorities in our lives. So for instance, what does it look like for me to put my husband above my kids in this life stage? I spend all day with my kids. I'm a stay-at-home mom. And so is this like a time thing? I mean, how can my husband even compete with that? When he comes home at the end of the day, am I supposed to spend just the rest of the day with him? Like, that's impossible. That's not how my life works. So what does it look like right now in this life stage for me to put my husband above my kids? And if you ask that question, God will answer you. He's given me some really creative answers to questions like that. Also, as we make our list, it's helpful to know that order of the day or net time spent, like I just said, does not necessarily signify order of priorities. However, if you find yourself consistently ignoring or neglecting a certain priority, that's a pretty good sign that it's either fallen down your list or completely fallen off your list. So when time gets tight and I'm wondering how to spend the minutes, my list of priority will tell me what is the next right thing to do. Just like Anna said, she had her list of priorities down. Do the next right thing, guys. So living out your personal list of priorities is just getting super serious about being obedient to God. It's figuring out what obedience to God looks like in this life stage, and then structuring your life to honor the priorities that he's given you, knowing that he's going to come through for you in the end. So often in moments of hardship, it's tempting to try to keep doing everything the same way that we did before the hardship descended. To continue to cook dinner for our families every night, to keep all of our kids in their activities, or to continue serving in just exactly the same way that we did before. But I believe that that is just a form of denial of the hardship that we're going through. The best way to weather the hardships that come at you in life is to acknowledge that you're going through a time of hardship, and to realize it's not going to last forever, but to decide which of your priorities you can let go of for the time being. So bonus, if you've already listed out your priorities from top to bottom, you just start cutting off the bottom of the list, you guys. So for example, let's say you get a really difficult medical diagnosis, like your mom gets cancer, and she's in town and you're going to be a big part of helping her get through this. You just start cutting off the stuff off the bottom of your list. And maybe these are things that are really life-giving to you in normal life, but they're things that you know you can let go of for a while. So maybe your kid gets a dialed-back birthday party this year. Maybe there's a few play dates coming up that you cancel. Maybe there's a big home renovation project that's just going to wait for a few months, right? But you certainly do not stop having quiet times, date nights, or exercising. Whatever your top 5 to 10 priorities are, those are not the things that fall to the wayside. So creating your list of priorities takes time and prayer. And the list may change over time as your season of life changes. But once you have an idea of what your list may look like, once you have a rough draft, it's a good idea to sit down with your spouse and or kids and hash out your priorities together. So for example, a number 15 for me might actually be a number 7 for them, and you'll kind of have to figure that out with them. Talking through your priorities list will also help your family understand why you're making the choices that you are moving forward. They'll understand a little bit better about why you've chosen to do something like a family vacation instead of volleyball camp this summer, for example. So by the time my 3rd pregnancy, I said I had 3 kids. By the time my 3rd pregnancy came around, I had my list of priorities, like I was gonna do this better this time. The first trimester hit and morning sickness, exhaustion, all the things. I just started cutting some things off the bottom of the list. 2nd trimester, I was okay. 3rd trimester hit, and just surprisingly, with 2 small children and a pregnancy, right, it got a little harder. And I remember the conversation that I had with my husband when I called him up on the phone and I said, honey, I just can't do it anymore. Don't make me do it. I cannot go to the store again with 2 small children while being pregnant. And you know what his answer was? Of course, honey, don't worry about it. I'll just stop by Aldi on the way home. That's fine. When you share your priorities with people and tell them the things that you need to cut off, I think you'll find that those who love you are very understanding and willing to help you out. Also during that time, my mom would come over and help me do freezer meals so that I could maintain my high priority of feeding my family healthy meals. I could maintain my high priority of meeting my budget every month and not order out every single night, right? But I could let go of cooking a meal from scratch. So then I gave birth. And that day I chopped off just everything from my list. I mean, the day you give birth, you're living maybe 3, 4, 5 priorities, not that many. Another amazing aspect of having our priorities listed from top to bottom is that we not only know how to walk into crisis or into hardship, namely by cutting things off the bottom of the list, but we also have a roadmap for walking out of survival mode, walking out of trial and hardship, namely by adding things on intentionally, one by one, when the time is right. So the day my daughter was born, I'm living 3 to 5 priorities. But I didn't stay there forever. 4 to 6 weeks in, I walked into my kitchen and I made a meal. I added back in, priority 7. And granted, it was probably blue box mac and cheese, but I did it. It was such a win. And then around 8 weeks, I walked into my living room and I did some yoga. Not a huge thing, but I added another priority back in. My husband and I also have a really high priority of knowing our kids' friends and serving in our church. So when my daughter was 3 to 4 months old, we went back to church, and we probably went back before that, but I started serving again at church in the nursery with my child. My priority list was my roadmap that allowed me to add things back into my life in a way that was life-giving and sustainable. So knowing our God-given priorities and intentionally living them out gives us such freedom in life. Freedom to say no when we need to, freedom to navigate stressful times without descending into crisis mode and burnout, and freedom to intentionally walk out of survival mode when the time is right and in the right way. I would encourage you to take some time to talk to God about what your personal priority list should look like. The first step may be even to ask God what your priority list is right now and what He might change, how He might make a couple of tweaks to bring more life and peace to your life right now. God cares about every choice that we make, every decision in front of us. He cares how we spend our days and our minutes, and it's our job to do so in a way that honors God. Father God, we thank you for being a trustworthy God. We thank you that even though this world has trouble, that you have overcome the world and that you want abundant life for us. Thank you for the work that you're doing in each of our lives. Amen.